Although there are many myths surrounding Vincent, there are almost none regarding Louise. Why? Probably because she was shamefully neglected for so long, receiving little attention other than being presented as a pious widow who assisted the great St. Vincent de Paul. Before the 20th century, an authentic biography of Louise was hard to find, whereas there have been more than 10,000 books and articles written about Vincent. You know, history has not always been kind to Louise, labeling her as neurotic, compulsive, excessively scrupulous, always in need of affirmation, and overprotective of her son, Michel. If you saw the magnificent film, Monsieur Vincent, and you knew nothing else about Louise, you would go away with a very sorry picture of her. How many of you have seen the film? All right, she always looks like, to me, like she's half dead in the picture, right? Whereas Vincent always appears as the intrepid hero, undaunted by any obstacle. She's portrayed as a shrinking violet, a woman frightened by life and terrified of poor persons. At least that's the way she comes across to me in the film. But that's a caricature. It's a gross misrepresentation of the resilient personality of a courageous woman who, for more than 200 years, was not given her due in the church. And we have to ask ourselves, was it perhaps because the church did not easily recognize foundresses who were illegitimate? They didn't, you know. Or was it, as others have thought, because of her excessive love for her son? Impediments to her canonization? Like all of us, we know Louise was the product of her heredity, environment, personal experience, and correspondence with grace, never knowing the identity of her mother, the early death of her father, and her delicate health molded her character. We know little of the events of her lonely childhood and adolescence because she rarely, if ever, spoke of them. Although the Marillacs were not financially poor, they were very well off, Louise endured one of the cruelest forms of poverty, the sense of not really belonging. She was rejected by her stepmother, and some scholars even question the identity of her father, although most agree that she was, in fact, a Marillac. We could find that out easily today by DNA, right? And perhaps this explains her inordinate love for her only child, and why she would place such a high priority on the care of those abandoned babies known as the foundlings. She loved the babies. Her beloved son, Michel, would be a constant source of worry to her throughout most of her life. Even 5 years before her death, when Michel was happily married, finally, and the father of a little girl, she was distressed about his increasing deafness, asking prayers for his cure so that he could find a worthy position to support his wife and daughter. The political misfortunes of her prominent family were another source of anguish. Her uncle Louis, now her father's name was Louis too, so you have Louis and Louis, the Louis brothers, huh? Her uncle Louis Marechal de France was convicted of treason and beheaded in the public square on May 10th, 1632. Her uncle Michel, her guardian, who had been a member of the cabinet of Cardinal Richelieu, the prime minister, became entangled in palace intrigue, plotting to overthrow Richelieu in hopes of replacing him. Instead, he was arrested, and for 2 years he languished in prison, where he eventually died just 3 months after his brother. And these dramas were playing out at the very time Louise was trying to form the company of the Daughters of Charity, and they were certainly bound to take their toll on such a sensitive person. So is it any wonder that she was very serious and introspective? In her earlier years, it was not so much a crisis of faith that she underwent as a crisis of hope, a feeling of solitude in the face of rejection by her own relatives. The crisis of faith would come later. In one of her writings, she reflects, "God, who has given me so many graces, led me to understand that it was God's holy will that I go to him by way of the cross. His goodness chose to mark me with it from my birth." Now, what was she thinking of? From my birth, her illegitimacy. She knew she was illegitimate. "And he has hardly ever left me at any age without some occasion of suffering." That's very strong, isn't it, huh? The inscription she requested to be placed on her tomb also attests to this: spes unica, crux spes unica. You Latin students know that means the cross, my only hope. And when it came time to decide on a motto for the company of the Daughters of Charity, she chose the words of St. Paul in 2 Corinthians, "The charity of Christ urges me." But, notice she added a word, a very significant word, "The charity of Christ crucified urges me." This is Louise's own, I don't know what you call it, stamp. And she sealed her letters from 1644 until her death with the sealing wax imprinted with that motto, which was really a reflection of her life. For a long time, she had struggled with guilt feelings for not keeping her promise to become a nun. However, tried and tested by painful misunderstandings, she lived outside the walls of the convent what the Jesuit George Aschenbrenner describes as monasticism of the heart, the experience that strips and purifies and scours the heart to a radical solitude of aloneness in and with God. Yet it was this same reliance on God alone that made her more compassionate. And as I said earlier, when the contemplative life was no longer an option to her, her relatives arranged a marriage for her. And this was normal in the 17th century. But the motives for their choice of a husband were a little less than pure. Louise was the only mariaque who could marry the man of their choosing. Antoine Legras, one of the Queen Mother's secretaries, because he was of the lower class. But this may have been a political ploy that would give the family greater access to the throne. They might not have been thinking about Louise's happiness at all. Since she was illegitimate, they did not consider her to be on the same level as the other Mariacs. They may have seen this alliance also as a good way to settle Louise in society, where they would no longer have to bother with her. The sensitive Louise would certainly have felt the undertones in all this. Even her marriage contract was a snub. Her relatives signed it, friends of the couple. In addition, she was given the simple title of Mademoiselle instead of Madame, which indicated a higher rank in the nobility. So it was a marriage of convenience that was especially convenient for the Mariac family. Yet, from all accounts, surprisingly, it was a happy union, where Louise enjoyed being at last part of a family of her own. And she was integrated into Parisian society at least until Antoine became a chronic invalid, and the marriage would end with his premature death. Knowing Louise, she may have felt that his condition was due to her own failure to keep her promise to become a nun, because at one point she contemplated leaving him to appease the wrath of God against her, if such were the case. Nevertheless, throughout her husband's long illness, she remained a dutiful wife, nursing him lovingly despite the change in his personality and his irascible disposition. Antoine died in her arms, leaving her in a state of anxiety to raise her little boy on her own, no help from the family. Before that, however, she had fallen into a state of depression, and in an effort to find peace again, she multiplied her prayers and fasts, almost as if she were trying to bribe God. It was about this time that she began to have doubts about the immortality of the soul, and she learned that she would have to find a new spiritual director. While she was at prayer on Pentecost, June 4th, 1623, she had what she referred to as an enlightenment or a light, which freed her from all her doubts. She didn't have to leave her husband. She felt free. She didn't have to worry, even though she was going to have a new confessor and director. She didn't know who it would be, of course, Vincent. She said, I will accept this even though it is repugnant to me. Now, can you think of something that's repugnant to you? I think of a snake. And the third, all her doubts about the immortality of the soul disappeared. So that's a very important part of Louise's life, the light of Pentecost. And she had the feeling as well that she would one day be able to devote her life to God in serving the neighbor. Now, you think that sounds very simple. It's not. This is the 17th century. Together with other women who would be doing the same. And this puzzled her, since at that time nuns were not permitted to leave their convents, even for good works. In addition, she seemed to understand that she would have a new spiritual guide, the one she felt repugnant to accept. And she didn't know then that it would be the little country priest, Vincent de Paul. In her wildest dreams, she couldn't imagine this, because he was of a completely different social class. You know, most of the important men in Louise's life would eventually disappoint or leave her. Her father died. Her spiritual director left for another diocese. He was named bishop. Her husband died. her two uncles died, and later she had all the worries about her son. Those were the men in her life. Louise needed someone who would understand and appreciate her, even though she was complex, and she was. But she also needed someone whom she, in her turn, could enrich with her own gifts. For a chosen soul like Louise, a special man of God was needed, and she would find this man in Vincent. And Vincent, aware of the cloud over her birth and of her other sufferings, would be able to give her the reassurance she lacked. And he must have perceived that in the midst of her painful trials, God was fashioning this woman in various ways for a special vocation. Now just think about it. Her solid classical education at the convent of Poissy, which would later stand her in good stead in her dealings with the ladies of the nobility and with civil authorities. Her practical preparation in domestic matters at the boarding house in Paris, where she would be able to transmit to the simple daughters of charity she was forming for service what she learned there. Her experience as a loving wife and mother and nurse to her husband, which would be very helpful in preparing the sisters to nurse the sick and to prepare remedies. And lastly, her organizational work with the confraternities of charity, giving her ample opportunity to use her leadership ability. All those life experiences developed in her the talents and qualities of governance, skills necessary to direct a community and to collaborate with the ladies. But before all this happened, she had to have this time of great trial, this question of faith, before she had the light of Pentecost. And this is what it looks like. We have it. It's all folded up like this into little. This is not the original. It's in the archives in Paris. But that's what it is. She wrote out her doubts and then how the doubts were resolved. And on the very back, there's just a little word, and it says lumière, light, or enlightenment. Her tendency toward perfectionism would certainly have increased her introspection and melancholy if Vincent hadn't guided her to become more open and responsive to needs around her. He drew her out of herself by giving her a little task to do for poor persons, as I told you before, causing her to focus less on herself and her own imperfections and more on others, especially on persons living in poverty. The spiritual author Robert Wicks, writing about Father Henry Nouwen's great respect for Buddhism, gives us the following reflection. Buddhism speaks about the wonderful possibilities that come about when we use the weeds in our life to make compost, to fertilize our interior garden. The belief is that persons with real problems or sins can become truly holy and compassionate beings. When this happens, their presence in the world is gracious and grace-filled, not in spite of their past life, but because of it. And I think Louise is a good illustration of someone who used the weeds in her life to become holy. Very encouraging, isn't it? One of those weeds, or more likely a thorn in her side, was her son, Michel. If ever she had a blind spot, it was her relationship with him, which would become increasingly problematic. In her eagerness to shower him with all the love that she herself had not received, she probably smothered him. Michel was the source of much of Louise's unrest, and she had good reason to worry about him. He had been a premature baby who would be a slow learner, unstable, lazy, wayward, and often sick. But she always excused him by saying that he's just like his mother. Her concern for Michel is seen in all her letters to Vincent before 1640. And Vincent's responses often contain advice concerning the boy. At times he gently chides the mother for her unreasonable distress. And one time he said, "I've never seen a woman such as you for feeling so guilty about certain things." On the other hand, we can't forget that she was a mother, and also a member of the illustrious Marillac family, even though her relatives treated her shabbily. And she would rise to her duty to raise her son as a respectable member of the social class to which they belonged, seeing to it that he had an honorable place in life, but it wasn't easy. After each of his misadventures, his disappearances, his consorting with bad companions, his turning from God and from his mother, she would welcome him back with open arms, like the father of the prodigal son. When it came time to arrange a marriage for him, just as her own marriage had been arranged, we see another facet of Louise in her position as a member of the nobility, using everything in her power to find a proper wife and a marriage worthy of the distinguished lineage that was theirs. That she succeeded admirably is seen in the joy she would at last experience of seeing Michel suitably married, and of her finally becoming a grandmother to little Louise Renee. Don't you like to think of Louise as a grandmother? You could see a happy Louise with her little granddaughter. So in following Louise's journey to holiness, we should not omit the part played by Michel, who in his wanderings contributed to his mother becoming a saint. I would not recommend that you should wish the same for your children. In this, she's like other saintly mothers who anguished over their children: Monica and her Augustine, Jane Frances and her son Celspenina, Elizabeth Ann Seton and her boys, and others like that. And besides, in all fairness to Michel, it couldn't have been very easy to have a saint for a mother. By inviting Louise to embrace a spirituality of failure rather than a desire to be perfect, Vincent showed her that for anyone who takes risks, failure, even as a mother, is a real possibility. We know from personal experience that when we attempt something new, we take the chance of missing the mark as well as of succeeding. But don't you think failure is so much easier when we're not alone, when we have someone to share it with us? Still, she never let her personal problems interfere with her role as superioress of the Daughters of Charity. All this business with her son running away, marrying a girl from the country, disappearing for 6 months. The sisters never knew this was happening. She just continued as superioress of the sisters. It took a strong woman to forge ahead in the midst of such torment in her private life. She took care that very few of the sisters were aware of her turmoil regarding Michel. I like to think that this tension in her life shows that she was a real human person, and it brings out the vulnerable side of a saint who had to struggle with many of the trials undergone by so many single mothers. Perhaps the absence of family love in her own early life did make her too affectionate with regard to Michel, but later she would be able to channel that maternal warmth into love for the sisters and care for Vincent. Thanks to modern research, Louise is portrayed today much more positively as an extremely perceptive, highly responsible organizer with a great deal of self-knowledge, even while she is recognized as being a too doting mother and a born warrior. Would a weaker woman have dared to undertake a 2-week journey by stagecoach, flat barge, and horseback over rough terrain to take her daughters to the new mission of Nantes, as she did, even while she was in poor health? Many well-balanced, integrated persons are anxious by nature, aren't they? Does this prevent them from being productive? Does this prevent us from being productive? Although Louise has often been eclipsed by Vincent, she was in fact the woman behind him, who used her feminine intuition, her good judgment, her astuteness to carry out his creative ideas for charitable works. By the very fact of her aristocratic background and the Marillac name, she could open doors that he could not. And she moved easily between the levels of society, working very closely with the upper-class ladies, but at the same time with the uneducated first sisters. Lively, intelligent, methodical, and deeply spiritual, she implemented Vincent's schemes on behalf of poor persons. He would get the inspiration, and she would put it into action, although she had many creative ideas of her own. He counted on her organizational skills, and he gave her complete latitude to act. She also used what she herself called her gentle persuasion to suggest, and in some cases to push, Vincent to act. I think in today's world she could be a highly effective CEO. Her tenacity in founding the Daughters of Charity, her leadership in the education of girls and young women, and her part in resolving other issues place her in the forefront of the true liberation of women, to whom, as a report of the United Nations Development Program reminds the world, life is dramatically unfair. 70% of the world's poor are female. 80% of refugees are women and children. In one of James Michener's books, entitled simply The Novel, the narrator, Lucas Yoder, pays tribute to his intrepid Pennsylvania Dutch wife, Emma. He says, "She is made of rose petals and granite. She kept us alive." Now, I don't think Vincent would have used such picturesque language, but he would probably agree that it aptly describes Mademoiselle, because it was due to her gentle persuasion, the rose petal part, and her tenacity, the granite, that we owe the preservation of the Vincentian spirit in so many instances. She was, indeed, the Iron Lady of the 17th century, and she has kept many persons alive. When the sisters became too numerous for the house in which they had been living, they had to look for another. Louise wanted to find one near Vincent so that she could consult him easily. But he said, no, I don't think so. He was concerned about avoiding any hint of scandal if people were to see the sisters and priests coming and going into one another's residences. Oh no, he said, tongues will wag. So the docile mademoiselle took one right across the street from St. Lazare, where St. Vincent lived. Father Richard McCullen once compared Louise to a diamond, because he said, diamonds are found buried far beneath the surface of the earth, her humility, and have qualities of beauty and of sturdy hardness resistant to outside pressures, her tenacity. And as the old French proverb states, ce que femme veut, Dieu le veut. What woman wants, God wants. And when she said, au nom de Dieu, in the name of God, get out of her way. One of Martin Luther's methods for winning converts was to open schools and to form catechists and leaders to teach the people. In the 17th century, instruction of the common people was often perceived as dangerous. Knowledge is power, as we said, because with education they might become uncontrolled and rebellious. Only 10% of girls were literate, and these belonged to the nobility. Louise loved children and was also enthusiastic about teaching others, like the ladies of charity, the country school mistresses, the daughters of charity, and young girls. She realized that education is a road out of poverty. So she instructed the sisters to go out of their way to reach adolescent girls at a time the girls would be free from their daily work. They couldn't go to school at the regular hours. Besides the truth of the Catholic religion, which she drew up in a catechism that she composed, the girls were taught reading and writing, but also spinning and lace making, so that they could become more independent and sell the fruits of their labors and not be at the mercy of some masters on whom they might be dependent and who sometimes took advantage of them. She herself instructed the members of the confraternities and corrected abuses she found in her inspections there. I wouldn't want to be there when Louise found one of my abuses. When she used to address the ladies in the country districts, her reputation spread so quickly that their husbands would hide under the bed or in the bushes to listen to her. And afterwards, they even asked her if she heard confessions. By royal command, the sisters were forbidden to take little boys into their schools. But Louise felt this would do no harm in the villages because their older sisters wouldn't go to class if it meant they had to leave their little brothers home alone. Vincent refused. No, he said, they must obey the king's regulations. He was very strong on authority. Louise reluctantly gave in, but I think she closed her eyes sometimes to what was going on in the country because it was a long way from Paris. Nevertheless, even though the sisters were not allowed to teach boys, she saw to it that workrooms staffed by priests or laymen, were created, and that when the boys reached the age of 12, they would be placed in domestic service or sent to learn a trade to provide for their future. When a new confraternity was set up in the rural areas, she tried to make sure that before the organizers left, there was a schoolmistress trained in each village to teach catechism to the children. To gain official support for her education project, she went to the Attorney General. Again, women did not do this. She went to him to ask permission to open a school for girls in Paris, a bold venture for a woman of that era. And the astonished man replied, "This has no precedent." He never had a woman come and ask him for that. But he gave her the authorization she was seeking. I think maybe the Mariac name might have lent weight to her request. So she did have her little school. And by the door of her little school, she placed a placard that read, "In this building is a little school. Louise de Marillac, schoolmistress, teaches young children divine service, reading, writing, composition, and grammar." See, more power to her. Being illegitimate herself, Louise had a special place in her heart for the hundreds of unwanted babies abandoned by their desperate mothers on the streets of Paris. Very little attention was given to this problem by the authorities. There was a house where the foundlings were taken in, but they were drugged to keep them quiet. And some of them were sold to beggars who broke their arms and legs to excite the compassion and open the pockets of passers-by. Vincent stated that in the 50 years that had just passed, not one of those babies had survived. When he and the Ladies of Charity decided to remedy the situation, they chose to house the foundlings in the abandoned military chateau of Bicêtre outside of Paris. Now, isn't that a pleasant place to raise little children? When Louise heard of this choice, she vehemently opposed it because she felt it was a dangerous, unsanitary, unsuitable place for children. And she also worried about the young sisters being harassed by the soldiers who were still on the grounds. She expressed her opinion to Vincent, and she even threatened to resign as administrator. Of course, she had to be in charge of the work. But when he insisted, she complied. He was the boss. She saved the lives of many babies by entrusting them to wet nurses and sending out competent persons to check on the quality of the care the babies were receiving. However, funding for this project was not forthcoming, and because she didn't have the money to pay the wet nurses, they began to bring the children back. She didn't know what to do. In the end, her fears were realized. Bicêtre proved to be a very costly disaster. Her fears were realized. The children eventually had to be moved back to Paris. However, there was one positive outcome of the stay in Bicêtre, and that was the creation by Louise of the first foster care program for babies in recorded history. That was due to Louise. In 1960, exactly 3 centuries after her death, Pope John XXIII publicly acknowledged Louise's outstanding contributions by proclaiming her the patroness of Christian social workers. But because of her contribution, her courage in confronting so many obstacles. I like to think of her as the patroness of dysfunctional families, or the patroness of warriors, or the patroness of single parents, because her wayward son helped her to attain holiness. Although she lacked support from her relatives, she was not only able to overcome her difficulties, but to become a leader and a saint in the bargain. The Marillac genealogy could boast of Jesuits, Carmelites, Ursulines, Benedictines, Capuchins, and 2 bishops, but the illegitimate, disclaimed Louise is the only canonized saint in its rank. A precious source of information regarding the leadership of Louise is found in the council minutes for the planning meetings of the Daughters of Charity. However, in reading the minutes, it's easy to see that she and Vincent did not always agree. There's an old adage that states, relationships, like harps, come with strings attached, neither too tense nor too loose, but each attuned to the other's vibrations. These meetings were usually conducted by Vincent, but both freely and simply expressed their opinions without being contentious or overbearing, regardless of their personal feelings. And even when Louise had opinions contrary to his way of thinking, if he insisted, she acquiesced, and she didn't make it obvious to the sisters that she disagreed. She told him that in private. In accepting or dismissing members, for example, Vincent felt that Louise was too demanding. Another example, when the official recognition of the Company of Daughters of Charity was received in 1646, this is the first recognition, Louise was very unhappy. She took issue with being called Sisters of the Poor of the Confraternity of Charity. She wanted the sisters to keep the name Daughters of Charity, the simple name. She also didn't want them dependent on the Archbishop of Paris, who might be able to tell them to do other things other than serving persons who were poor. She said, no, no. So she wrote to Vincent, in the name of God, monsieur, watch out. She's really miffed when she starts in the name of God or for the love of God. In the name of God, monsieur, do not allow anything to happen that would even in the slightest draw the company away from the direction God has given it, because you can be sure that immediately it would no longer be what it is, and thus I believe that the sick poor would no longer be assisted, and God's will would no longer be accomplished among us. I mean, she's very strong. It took 10 years, but Louise eventually got her way on both counts, the second approval in 1655. She had the title of Daughters of Charity, and the sisters were under the perpetual direction of the Congregation of the Mission and not of the Archbishop, so that they could keep the same spirit for serving persons who were living in poverty. At the council meetings, Vincent almost always got his way, except for one meeting, which was conducted by Louise, because Vincent had been in an accident and hurt his head. He was present, but the Iron Lady definitely had the upper hand that day. And here's a what if for you. What if Louise had entered the cloister? the Daughters of Charity, and all the other communities and groups that have sprung from them, including ourselves, might never have come into existence, right? Poor persons would have been much poorer without her, and we would never have been gifted with the achievements of this exceptional woman in the fields of healthcare, education, and social ministry. I think you can understand why this section on Louise is entitled, "What Woman Wants, God Wants," right? She usually got what she wanted. However, there was one instance when God obviously wanted something very different from what this valiant woman wanted. As you know, both she and Vincent died the same year, 1660. In his last personal note, Vincent usually didn't write too many personal notes to Louise, but in this one, in March 1659, he seems to be making up for all the times that he has taken her for granted. He writes, "I'm ashamed for having taken so long to thank Mademoiselle Legras for all the good things she does for us. I do so now with all the gratitude of my heart, and I ask our Lord to be himself her reward." See, he knew he was dying himself. You can imagine Louise when she received that, how happy she must have been. On Christmas Eve of 1659, Louise herself knew that she was dying. And nearby, her dear friend was also seriously ill. You know, Louise had never asked for much for herself, but she does have one last wish to ask of Vincent. And she writes, "My powerlessness to accomplish any good prevents me from having anything acceptable to offer to our Lord, except the deprivation of the only consolation his goodness has given me for 35 years. What's she talking about? A visit from Vincent. The only consolation that God has given her in 35 years. But I accept this for love of him, without, however, she never gives up, losing the hope of seeing you, if it would not endanger the little health he has given you." Now, how could Vincent refuse? But he does not come. And 1 month later, she repeats her plea, but he allows her neither a visit nor a letter. Instead, he simply sends a brother across the street with the verbal message, "Tell her that she is going first, and if God forgives me my sins, I hope to meet her very soon in heaven." Well, it may be that he was too sick to act himself, or perhaps the separation was as great a sacrifice for him as it was for her. We can only guess what he would have said had he given her the consolation she was seeking. In any case, the cross that was never far from either of them, in the form of illness, misunderstandings, and the birth pangs of bringing forth their respective communities, accompanied these two companions on the journey of charity to the end, to be transfigured in the resurrection of their imminent reunion in heaven.